Good morning. My name is Debora and I'm part of the Precious Kings family. I'm so happy to be with you this morning. For those of you watching online, great to have you with us. Last week, we had the privilege of having John Woods starting us off on this series, When Life Hurts, the book of Job. I felt like drinking a glass of fresh water after being in a very long, hot journey. So refreshing and profound. So much truth and richness to hold on to. If you missed it, I highly recommend it. We are on this journey going through the book of Job, and through this series, we went to looking how Job's friends responded to his suffering, as well as how Job responded to God in the midst of so much suffering, so we can learn from it. In this life, we will encounter suffering, hopefully nothing as devastating as Job. But if so, how can we humans in our little understanding make sense of it all? We can't. But we can still have hope and be a source of encouragement to others going through the most painful experience one can have on this journey of life. Life is complicated and suffering is a mystery. We have learned that Job was an extraordinarily rich, blameless, and an upright man according to the Bible. And by God's sovereign permission, he was put to test, losing all his wealth, his children, and his health, becoming very miserable and in so much physical pain. He went from being orientated, having everything in perfect order, to then being completely disorientated, everything upside down, having lost everything, to finally be reorientated and being restored. Today, we're going to be looking at one of his friends, Eliphaz, a friend that had a good heart intention to comfort Job, but due to his theology backed up with his spirituality and lack of sympathy, was far from the comfort he was hoping for and in need for. On the other hand, we see Job's frustration at his friend's lack of ability to understand him, and also how Job begins to have a glimpse of something that back then was unknown: grace. Now let's for a moment imagine ourselves in that situation Job was in. Then let's read God's word in Job 4:7-8, when in one of his speeches, Eliphaz tries to comfort him. It says, "Consider now, who being innocent has ever perished? Where were the upright ever destroyed? As I have observed, those who plow evil and those who sow trouble reap it." Eliphaz is clearly only what the screen of his worldview allows him to see. He brings a message from the religious system. You must have sinned or done something wrong to deserve this punishment. Undeserved punishment doesn't exist. You sow, you reap. Sadly, we still see that happening in our days. We can fall into the same trap. So many are deceived by the thoughts that by doing good works, you can have God's favor. Therefore, if you have suffering in your life, you must have done something to deserve it. Not once Eliphaz tried to put himself in Job's shoes. He had no sympathy and no compassion. Then he continues in chapter 4:12-17. It says, "A word was secretly brought to me. My ears caught a whisper of it. Amid disquieting dreams in the night, when the deep sleep falls on men, fear and trembling seized me and made all my bones shake. A spirit glided past my face, and the hair on my body stood up to end. It stopped, but I could not tell what it was. A form stood before my eyes, and I heard a hushed voice. Can a mortal be more righteous than God? Can a man be more pure than his maker?" Here, Eliphaz gives a spiritual message, even mystic and mysterious, out of a good intention, but wasn't in tune with God's heart. And we see that when in chapter 42:7, the Lord speaks to Eliphaz and his friends. "I'm angry with you and your two friends, because you have not spoken the truth about me as my servant Job has." God does speak through visions and words, and in mysterious ways. We can see it all through the Bible, and it's still today. But here we see Eliphaz using of this spirituality to speak out what he thinks. We need to be diligent and discerning when giving words to one another. Are we in tune with the Father's heart? Or are we using powerful truth about God as a way of getting our views and beliefs across? A few years ago, I had the experience of looking after a paralyzed lady. She was paralyzed from her neck down. She was a believer and went to church for years. Then she was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, and it started deteriorating. Through that challenging period, she had so many people praying for her and giving words and prophecies of healing, but she only got worse and worse, to the point she was completely paralyzed. Initially, her husband was her prime carer, but one morning he had a heart attack in the shower. She noticed his absence through the day, clueless to what had happened, and only found out later in the day when a nurse came for a checkout routine. Sorrow after sorrow. After so much pain and loss, she could not go to church anymore just because she couldn't bear all the prayers and words of healing and seeing nothing happening. She let me pray for her, and as her tears rolled down her face, I could just imagine the excruciating pain she has endured and the anguish in her battle trying to keep her faith through it all. In all these years of never-ending suffering journey she's been through. Now, you might have been on the other side of the spectrum. You have tasted deep suffering and you received this judgmental comfort or spiritual words which left you feeling worse than you already were. Or maybe you have been in a position of giving the wrong words with a good intention to comfort. Most people wish they could erase suffering out of the dictionary. Today's culture of comfort and instant gratification has no patience for suffering. Most people want to drag it, escape it, divorce it, do anything but live with it. We need to learn to sit and be quiet, to listen to our friends in suffering. Learn to put ourselves in their shoes. Sometimes we don't need to say anything, just be with them. Jesus told us to cry with those that cry. Our human instinct is to run away from suffering. We want to fix it and remove it. But we need to learn to endure not only our sufferings, but also of those around us. We also do not want to fear the prophetic, but fear the Lord, so that we don't take things lightly. We want to learn from Eliphaz what not to do, not to use of spirituality to bring a message that we think people need to hear, but instead learn to hear the heart of God for people and be led by the Spirit, not by our theology. We can't underestimate the power of words to heal or to harm. People in suffering long for words of truth and grace. Now let's look one of Job's replies to Eliphaz in chapter 6:2. If only my anguish could be weighed and all my misery be placed on the scales, it would surely outweigh the sound of the seas. No wonder my words have been impetuous. The arrows of the Almighty are in me. My spirit drinks in their poison. Eliphaz has completely underestimated the weight of Job's suffering. How many times can we naively underestimate people's suffering? Can we put ourselves in the shoes of this paralyzed widow I mentioned earlier? How can we make sense of what she has been through? Is it not multiple sclerosis enough already? Dealing with the loss of her body movement, all her freedom, independence, having to rely on someone for every single activity of her day for the rest of her life. Why having to lose her husband too? Her companion, the thing that probably was keeping her going, her precious loving husband. Questions we simply can't answer. Can you feel the weight of her suffering? Life is hard and suffering is a mystery. How did she feel every time someone had visions and gave a prophecy or prayers for healing? We are to pray for healing, yes. But let's learn from Jesus. He spent enough time with the Father in prayer to know the Father's heart, therefore fulfill His will in everything He did. So everything He did for people was in obedience to the Father's will. We need to learn to listen to God's heart for people. We don't see the bigger picture and what is behind those sufferings and what God is working in people's life. For Job, the end of his suffering was here on earth. For some of us, it will be in heaven. Now you might be thinking, I haven't experienced anything so dramatic in my life, and that's okay. But we need to have compassion for those that have. Only when we put ourselves in people's shoes, we can be able to imagine and try to feel their pain. Then we can respond with love and grace. Let's think about the current situation we're in. To some extent, some more than others, but we all have lost something with this pandemic. Our freedom to go wherever we want, whenever we want. Our freedom to gather, to worship and have fellowship. Some have had greater loss by having to grieve in the midst of so much isolation. My sister sent me a very tender, heartbreaking message of her friend in Brazil. She got engaged before the pandemic hit the world, and now her fiancé is fighting for his life so poorly with COVID-19 that wouldn't even resist a transfer to another hospital. Her world turned upside down from the extreme joy of dreaming with her fiancé for the future together and the start of a family, to extreme pain and unbelief that he could be taken from her, and with it all their dreams. Her tearful, shaking voice message saying, "We need a miracle, only God can save him," broke my heart. We know God is a God of miracle, but what if that miracle doesn't happen? Life is hard and suffering is a mystery. For some of us, we'll have our tears wiped away only in heaven. Some have lost their jobs, homes, businesses. Some have been hit by depression. Marriages have been put to strain. New mothers had the huge loss of entering motherhood in such a lonely environment. And the list goes on and on. So how do we process our loss in line with the knowledge of the greatness and goodness of God we have? When we know He's able to change our circumstances, able to heal, but He's not. He's allowing it to happen. And that's how Job felt. We see the anguish in his words in verse 4 of the same chapter. "The arrows of the Almighty are in me, my spirit drinks in their poison. God's terror are marshaled against me." We can learn from Job how to be brutally honest with God without turning our hearts against Him. He says in verse 11, "Therefore I will not keep silent. I will speak out in the anguish of my spirit. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul." All Job has known about God, he still believes. But God's inexplicable ways have his mind perplexed to the breaking point. But he longs for God to be honored by his life and by his death. He doesn't understand why all his suffering, and after so many questions without answers, Job seems to be grasping something which back then was new to his friend's understanding and vocabulary: grace. We see that in another speech from Job to his friend Eliphaz in chapter 16:19. "Even now my witness is in heaven, my advocate is on high." He seems to be discovering grace. He discovers that the kindest, most well-meant religious and philosophical counsel can ultimately provide no comfort. Only the truth of the cross can do that, for only the cross reveals redemptive suffering. Even then, well before Jesus, Job seems to be able to see what was going to be the reality. Jesus, our advocate. Only the gospel of the cross can make sense of suffering. In a split of a second, on a hot July afternoon, a diving accident transformed the life of Joni Eareckson Tada forever. At the age of 17, she went from being an active woman to facing every day in a wheelchair. Though she suffered deep depression and lost the will to live in the aftermath of her accident, she gradually came back to a deeper relationship with God. Today, she's an internationally known mouth artist, a talented vocalist, a radio host, an author of 17 books, and an advocate for disabled persons worldwide. She wrote, "God uses suffering to purge sin from our lives, to strengthen our commitment to Him, force us to depend on grace, bind us together with other believers, produce discernment, foster sensitivity, discipline our minds, spend our time wisely, stretch our hope, cause us to know Christ better, make us long for truth, lead us to repentance of sin, teach us to give thanks in time of sorrow, increase our faith, and strengthen character." Real satisfaction comes not in understanding God's motives, but in understanding His character, in trusting in His promises, and in leaning on Him and resting in Him as the sovereign who knows what He's doing and does all things well. He has chosen not to heal me, but to hold me. The more intense the pain, the closer His embrace. This is the only time in history when I get to fight for God. This is the only part of my eternal story when I'm actually in the battle. Once I die, I'll be in celebration mode, in a glorified body, in a whole different set of circumstances. But this is my limited window of opportunity, and I'm going to fight the good fight for all I'm worth. What an inspiring woman she has become, in despite of her ongoing suffering. Going back to Job in chapter 23:10, we see him having that deep revelation that his suffering is refining him as the fire refines gold. When He has tested me, I will come forth as gold. The Bible tells us that Jesus Himself, being the Son of God, learned obedience from what He suffered. And once made perfect, He became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey Him. So even at the cross, God permitted what He hated, the unjust and agonizing death of His own precious Son, in order to accomplish something He prized above His own Son's cruel death. That is, salvation for a world of sinners. So the world's worst murder becomes the world's only salvation. If we had never known physical pain in our lives, how could we appreciate the nail-scarred hands with which Jesus will meet us? I have seen suffering since young age. Being born to a disabled mother, I have never had the same journey as others might have. She couldn't take me to the school or to the park. She couldn't run after me, and so on. There have been many restrictions in her life, and she herself is in a wheelchair now. But God works in mysterious ways. Her disability was the very reason for which her father and entire family became followers of Jesus. My grandfather was a spiritualist, and having tried everything to save my mother from the paralysis caused by polio and not finding anything, in a desperate move, he went to an evangelist event where he found salvation. My mom was never healed, but my grandfather met the healer, Jesus. Corrie ten Boom, a Holocaust survivor who helped many Jews escape from the Nazis during the Holocaust in World War II by hiding them in her home, she quotes, "In order to realize the worth of the anchor, we need to feel the stress of the storm. You can never learn that Christ is all you need until Christ is all you have." Precious friends, brothers, sisters, to all of you watching online, I want to encourage you today as we go through the trials, the fires, the storms, the deserts, the highs and lows, the deepest sufferings and loss on this very short period of life, on this side of eternity, here on earth. Let's fix our eyes on Jesus and endure pain, for all is worth to remain in Him. And let's learn to pour out our hearts without fear to our Father in heaven. Let's endure suffering, knowing that we are being refined as gold and drawn closer and into a deeper relationship with Jesus. And when our friends and families and anyone we may know do face suffering and go through deep sorrow, let's be Jesus' hands and feet. Let's give compassion and grace as we have received. Job's friends back then hadn't encountered grace, but we have fully received it in Jesus. Let's learn to cry with those that cry. Let's learn to discern the voice of the heart of God for people above our own theology and worldview. You see, we do not access God's work by what we see. We live by faith and not by sight. God doesn't reveal His grand design. We only ever see part of the picture. One day we will stand amazed to see the top side of the tapestry and how God beautifully embroidered each circumstance into a pattern to our good and for His glory. In the meantime, we are to deal with the frustration one has by the feeling of being behind the picture. Because we can't see it, it doesn't mean it's not there. Imagine the frustration of my grandfather, knowing the healer, but not receiving the so desired healing for his daughter. Now he's in celebrating mode with Jesus in heaven and has access to the bigger picture. But he had to endure over 30 years of walking on earth, seeing the struggles his daughter faced each day. He endured and finished the race, and now he's in celebration mode. The psalmist says in Psalm 27, 13, 14, I remain confident of this. I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord. Be strong and take heart and wait for the Lord. There is a waiting time before we get to the end line of this journey and finally meet Him face to face and get to see the bigger picture. For now, suffering brings us to our knees, strip us from all we can rely on in our human strength and force us to trust. I've learned that holding on to frustration doesn't lead me anywhere else but to despair and sadness. But letting go of the frustration and throwing myself into Jesus' loving arms renews my strength and fills me with peace. Instead of running away from suffering and dwelling in frustration, I choose to let it lead me to Jesus. I was watching the seagulls in a very windy day. Just like some birds when navigating strong crosswinds. Instead of fighting the wind, they adjust the angle of their body into the wind, while keeping their head fixed on the target destination in order to maintain forward motion. Let's fix our eyes on Jesus, our target destination, and adjust to the strong winds of suffering and keep moving forward until we reach our ultimate destination, our heavenly home. While it's on this journey, always remembering that we live by faith, not by sight. Hebrews 11:1 reminds us, faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. We live by faith in Jesus and His character. He is our living hope. We put our trust in His unfailing love and not on our temporary circumstances and what our human eyes can see or our understanding. We can have the confidence that the one who was willing to pour out His life for us is faithful and will sustain us through it all. Amen.